Thank you very much. And Stan, I will tell you that I grew up in Arkansas, so not too far from Alabama. So what my father used to say was, and he would say it very jokingly, I'm fixing to commence to get started. So,
I understand exactly what you're saying.
okay. So what I'm going to do today, hopefully, is help you to understand a process that we have developed for putting a course through the evaluation process that Lonnie was talking about, starting to look at a course from a standards perspective and being able to assess whether or not it is addressing the goals of the course. And so what I'm hoping to do in this presentation is to lay some groundwork for you to look at, first of all, the need for a course review process. Why do we need to do this? The background on the IFPTI course review process, how we actually developed and vetted this process, what it actually does, what's the point of it, how do we do it, and then the need for a protocol or a standard. And so ultimately the goal is for you to leave this presentation understanding the value of a course review process. So, our course review process, yesterday you became familiar with the curriculum framework and the courses, but there needs to be a way that we can vet the courses in the framework and hold them up against a standard. So what's important is that we have uniformity across all the courses. So what's important is you don't want to have a course that's in one element of the curriculum framework that was, say, developed by a subject matter expert that went off on his or her own and created a course, and yet another one in another part of the framework that followed all the proper process. So it becomes imbalanced. And so what's important is that all these courses that are created for food protection, that they are using a standard. Now we took a look at all of the existing quality standards for training, and many of you, if you're a training provider, you may have one of these, you may comply with one of these standards. And so we looked specifically at ANSI and at IACIT and ISO. We looked at all three of these standards, and we looked at it, we conducted a gap analysis to determine what is different, from these standards, and what do we need to be doing differently to look at a standard. So from a historical perspective, several years ago, around 4 to 5 years ago, we published an article on the importance of quality in training and why that's important. We also talked with our IFPTI Advisory Council. Some of you in the room actually participate in that advisory council. It's I have to say it's a very illustrious group of representing just about all the stakeholders of food protection training in the United States. And so we presented to our advisory council. And then we also looked at a process that had already been created for internal courses at the Department of Homeland Security. One of our training partners, NCBRT, which some of you are familiar with, the National Center for Biomedical Research and Training, they work with Homeland Security in their process. So we wanted to take a look at that. And we took all those inputs into account to develop a process at IFPTI. And then the next step was, as I believe Jerry talked about yesterday, there was a national curriculum team. That was 15 people that were originally the ones that helped us to flesh out that original framework. And we presented and vetted this course review process with those folks and got their feedback. And then we came to DHRD. We wanted to get the feedback at DHRD and see what they thought about it. And once we received that feedback, then we decided, okay, we're ready to actually put this process together. So under our cooperative agreement with the FDA, we drafted an initial course review process. And it was probably a bit more involved and more detailed than where it is today. We subsequently determined that in order for it to be usable, it needed to be modified somewhat. And then we also talked with our partners in Canada at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and then subsequently with Safe Food Canada Learning Partnership, and began to share that with other stakeholders. And there's really developed over time, particularly, I would say it's a growing interest over the past year, really a groundswell of interest in this course review process. So that's what we're going to walk through with you. So these are the elements of the course review process. We're going to go through each one of them systematically and talk them through. Needs analysis, the subject matter expert selection process, the instructional design and development, instructor development, the administrative support for the course, the evaluation process that is built into the course, and then a course delivery audit. So we'll go through each of those segments one at a time. So let's talk about the needs analysis. So one of the first things that's very important is to establish the need for this course. What's critical as a course is being reviewed is to document and then to have an understanding of the methodology that is used to establish the need, and looking at the results of the needs analysis, and then being able to have that methodology and the results to demonstrate the support for why that course should be developed. And so that's one of the most critical things in the beginning, is to establish that need. And so it's not enough to be able to say someone wanted a course to be created. That's not sufficient. So it's establishing the need, and it's putting in place in the very first step a scientific basis for the development of a course. So then the second step, the subject matter expert selection process. So it's important in your documentation as you're creating a course that you document the process that you're going to utilize to identify your subject matter experts who will be, provide the key input on a given course. And it's also important to document the actual credentials of the subject matter experts. So you wouldn't want your Toyota certified mechanic to work on your Lincoln Continental or something. Well, they don't make Continentals anymore. Your Lincoln. You wouldn't want your Toyota, mechanic to work on your Lincoln. You wouldn't want someone who's a subject matter expert in, someone give me an example. Anybody have an example?
Microbiology.
So you wouldn't want someone who's a microbiologist
Doing blood banking.
doing blood banking. That's a good one. Right. So, and keep in mind that what we're talking about here is a process to document as well. So maintaining all these records. When we, going back to the other standards, when we submitted to IACIT for accreditation for IACIT, we submitted, was it 10 notebooks about this thick? So we'll get a little bit more into this in a few minutes, but I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier was, the difference between those credentials and those accreditations and this process is those are all about the system and about putting in place the systems to ensure that you have all the record keeping and all the different policies in place. And that's one of the things that when you submit to IACIT, you submit reams and reams of documentation on all your different policies. And so this course review process is different, focused more on content, but it's still very important that you have the documentation of things like your subject matter experts. Okay, then we get into the real meat of the course itself. And this is the instructional design and development documentation. Now, in the actual course review process, there are 42 elements. This is just a sampling of some of those elements. For example, I know many of you at the FDA are familiar with job task analysis because you've done a lot of them. And that's one of the elements, is if there is job task analysis that's been done, to make sure that all of that's well documented. And that's a body of knowledge that you have to base your course on. Another is looking at Bloom's taxonomy. And I believe in your notebooks or the handout book, it's in your appendix. So Bloom's taxonomy is there. And you want to make sure that when you look at that pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy, that you are hitting the highest order of Bloom's taxonomy as possible. So in other words, you're not just training people for knowledge, but you're actually training them. You want to move towards creation, or create, which is at the top of the pyramid. And what that means is that people are not just learning for knowledge, they're not just learning to be able to do a task, but they're actually learning to be able to apply it and then create new ideas, new concepts, new ways of approaching. You want to make sure that the content arrangement and course alignment is there. So also in your materials, you'll have an example of a course alignment planning document. So it's very important that that gets documented. And then the structural elements of the course. The competencies, the scope, the learning objectives, these are all well documented. Reading list and assessments is another important part. What is the reading that a participant should involve themselves in before they get to the course, or what is some supplemental reading that they may want to read in conjunction with the course? And how are they being assessed? What are the exercises and what is the interactivity? I mean, the worst thing in the world is to have a training where it's all about PowerPoint slides and people sit there and listen. And so evaluating the ability for interaction between the instructor or instructors and the participants. And then evaluation, that's another important element, is how are the participants being evaluated? You know, when I first started becoming familiar with all this at IFPTI, and Stan mentioned that I had taught in the university level, I wish that this sort of thing had been available for people who teach in the universities, because there was nothing like that for those of us going through graduate school. But if there had been, it should have been mandatory for every person getting, trained as a faculty member to know the science behind creating a course. So the next part, the next element of the course review process is instructor development, and making sure that your instructors have an application process, that there's a ability to apply and evaluate their credentials, and looking at a selection process. So being able to document how instructors apply and how they're selected. What are the qualifications of an instructor for a specific course? Another element is diversity. Now, what we mean here as far as diversity is not just looking at things like racial and ethnic diversity, gender diversity, but diversity of input, diversity of experience, and making sure that you have that range of input. So something that Roberta talked about earlier was the industry, the understanding among regulators of the culture of industry. Well, you're not going to necessarily have someone who's spent their entire career within a regulatory agency being able to communicate about industry culture if they haven't lived it and experienced it. But there may be people who have industry experience who are the right experts to provide that input. So they can, they have that diversity of input. Field experience and credentials. It's very critical that you have people who have actually been in the job, done the work, and they know what they're translating to people who are learning how to do the work. Evaluation, observation, and audit, and coaching and remediation. So you have to have a method for evaluating your instructors. You have to have, it's important that you have an observation and audit process so that instructors are not just going out and delivering time after time with no feedback loop. And then there's also an opportunity for coaching and remediation. Even the absolute best instructor that you've ever had in the world has a coach or someone who gives them pointers and tips. So I recently started working with a personal trainer, and she's one of the most fit people I've ever, experienced. And she told me about her coach, her fitness coach. And I was shocked that she actually had a coach, but she had a coach because she too needs help in making sure that she's doing the right techniques on lifting weights and that sort of thing. And so it's very important that every instructor, no matter how experienced they are and no matter how long they've been instructing, that there's still that opportunity for feedback. So another important element to a course review is the administrative support. There's both technology needs and the technical support that's needed for an instructor. There's things like redundancies. So, for example, if we have these Pelican cases that go out for a course to be taught. It's just those hard cases that hold all the materials, and there has to be some redundancy so that you have a backup plan. If a computer fails, if a projector fails, you have to have backups and plan Bs. And so that's important to have those in place. Clearly delineated delivery responsibilities, laying out who's responsible for what task to make sure that a course happens the way it's supposed to happen. So if someone thinks that their job was just to make sure that the door was open for the room to be available, and what their job really was not only have the room open, but to also have all the materials laid out in front of each seat, the name placards, then that's a miscommunication. So you just have to make sure that you have all these delivery responsibilities spelled out in advance. There's also many policies that need to be put in place. Everything from ensuring that Americans with Disabilities Act that everything's in compliance with that there are privacy policies in place, that there are records management policies in place. These are all things that have to be evaluated. There's an enrollment process and that attendance is taken. And then finally that there are certificates and transcripts available. So we have a learning management system. I know you all at the FDA have a learning management system. Many of you have them if you're a training provider. So many of these things can be managed through a learning management system. Then the evaluation process is critical. Process improvement is the focus, making sure that these evaluations are done so that the course can be improved, that the instructor can improve, and that the process overall can be improved. So you have to have an evaluation strategy. It's not enough to just say we're going to evaluate, but what is your strategy for evaluation? Looking at Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, and again, Kirkpatrick is in your handout or in your notebook, so you'll have that there as a reference. And as I said before, you want to evaluate both your instructors and your course and have a policy and a process in place for that course evaluation. And then how are you going to use the results? What's the dissemination process? Are you going to share the results with the participants? Are you only going to share them internally? Are you going to publish evaluation summaries? How are you going to use those evaluation results? And then the course delivery audit. Instructors are audited, and the content delivery is audited, and the actual materials are audited. So So it's putting in place a process where someone who's designated as an auditor goes out and observes the delivery of a course. And they have a kind of an audit sheet where they review how the instructor does. They review how the materials are delivered, actually looking at the material, and then how those course materials are used. So, for example, one of the things that we'll be looking at with the Preventive Controls Alliance course is making sure that the, there's a template, a actual course content, and making sure that when that's delivered, if an instructor is deviating from it, we'll have to provide them feedback that they've deviated from the sort of quote-unquote approved content. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we took a look at ANSI, at IACIT, and ISO standards for training, and we did a crosswalk. This is something we did earlier this year where we did a crosswalk between those standards and this course review process. So our fellowship program is ANSI accredited, so we became quite familiar with the ANSI process in the context of getting that ANSI accreditation, and also with IACIT when we went through the IACIT approval process. And when we did this crosswalk between those three standards and looking at our process, what we found was that there were administrative and systems elements that were very similar, but that the course-specific elements, looking at the content, was not necessarily covered by those standards. And so for that reason, we felt that there was an important value in moving forward with this. And so we spent some time with ANSI talking with them about the difference, and they felt comfortable that there was an opportunity to go forward with something that's sort of a carved out different approach than those three, and that there was a need for a course review process that would really drill into the content of a course. And so the process that we are pursuing going forward is, now that we've established this course review process, now the next step is to elevate it to a protocol. And the difference between a process and a protocol is a bit more firmed up. It's actual procedure that you follow. And establishing the protocol, and then the next step would be to bringing that protocol to a standard. And the path that we've chosen to pursue is kind of a two-step process for a standard. So the first step, I mentioned earlier that we've partnered with our Canadian counterparts, and together we are pursuing what's called a publicly available standard. And I think some of you were in a training last week with the British standards. I heard some people talking about that. Yeah. So the British Standards Institute, I think they're called, BSI, they have a procedure for creating a publicly available standard. And what that is it's a group of stakeholders gather together to create a protocol to submit as a standard, and it becomes publicly available because it's submitted through a comment period, and it can live as a publicly available standard for a period of time, and then it's sort of, once the publicly available standard is out there, no one owns it in particular, and then it can be elevated to an ISO standard. And so that's the process that we'll be pursuing, and we're hopeful that it's something that will be adopted by the food industry as an opportunity for having training quality. And I will say that in this process that we're going through with our Canadian counterparts, there is very widespread interest from both industry and government for having this kind of standard, so that training, purchasers of training, whether you're government or whether you're industry, that you can have more of a say in asking for quality in the training that you are purchasing.